Welcome to Storycomic Presents, where we interview amazing storytellers and artists. This is episode 54. I'm your host, Barney Smith of storycomic.com. With us is celebrated comic book guide writer and reviewer David Buesing of comicbookherald.com. Dave, thank you for joining us tonight.
Thank you for having me, Barney. It's a pleasure to be here. I look forward to talking about Comic Book Herald and myself a little bit. I've been on the interviewer side of things over the last year or so, right? So I'm a little more comfortable and a little more familiar with talking to various comics creators, which is one of the things I do on the podcast there, which is super fun and has been really interesting. But I'm looking forward to actually answer some questions about what it is that I do. It's funny. I dislike talking about myself, I would say, like on a personal level. I don't know if you're similar. Like that always brings me just like great embarrassment, like immediately, like if people like want to get to know me. But then when it comes to like talking about Comic Book Herald, like I can go forever. Like it's like there's some like disconnect there where it's like a separate thing, even though it's, it's my baby, it's my product,
And when before we went on air, we were chatting about how you got it formed and like out of all, and I gotta just gotta say too, for the people that are listening later or watching this, is that out of all the review sites and all the stuff about reviews and guides, it's like your comicbookherald.com is the most accessible, it's the most endearing, it's the most as you say, there's a level of what's the word I'm looking for, like I said, there's a welcoming, there's an accessibility, there's a bit of like unknown nostalgia when reading some of your blog posts and then watching some of your videos. It's like this is a guy who can talk on all levels. So
I appreciate that. That's very nice of you. Yeah, no, it's definitely accessibility. Like, I mean, that's kind of the point of Comic Book Herald, is like it started as an endeavor in making comics more accessible. Like, first off, just selfishly, like to myself, right? Like that was a thing where I got into comics later in life. I had affinity for them through non-paper sources. You know what I mean? Like animated television series, video game stuff, right? And like my dad was a big comics fan, so I had like a general affinity for like those universes. And I think it's something we see now a lot, honestly, where there are entire immense fandoms who have never picked up a comic, but they love the MCU or something, right? And it's like they know these characters and they know this world in a way that I did prior to actually diving into comics. But anyway, when I got kind of like towards like college, oddly, and then like out and like got my first gig, it was basically like, yeah, I actually want to read these things. I'm curious, and it's immense, right? It's this huge. Where do I start? What do I actually read here? It's just like there's so much to it. So Comic Book Herald, like at its core, is about making that accessible, whether that's something you're brand new to, something you fell out of. Like when we were talking right before we started, and you said, basically like you have an 8-year period where you just kind of stop reading comics or whatever, right? Or maybe even longer. And it's just like, yeah, I think I've gotten, I mean, of the many, many notes I've gotten, which are all really interesting and greatly appreciated. Like there are so many readers who are like, yeah, I used to read back in the 70s. I stopped, but I want to start again in like 2016. And it's like, it's the journey of like when and why people want to get into comics. It's so varied. And I think roadmaps and guides are often very, very useful to help understand that, like at least within certain confines, like, hey, here's the important stuff. Here's what'll help you read. And then, I mean, some people want to read absolutely everything. And it becomes this whole big question of, do you need to, should you? But Comic Book Herald's more about like, here's what you like, here's what'll help you the most, and make this, an enjoyable experience as opposed to homework, which it often can become. So yeah, that's kind of the general idea.
So then let me ask you then, because it's like, at comicbookherald.com, you have a nice list. I'll pull it up for people to see. Is that right here? You have, you got beginner's guides here for people and where to start. You also have things on DC, your best lists. And I think it's really helpful too, is you also have a reading order, and also too, I love your reviews that you've put out as well. So let me ask you a question about your beginner's guides and stuff like that. Is like, where do you sit on title relaunches? Are you a fan, or are you?
Sure. So that's a tricky one. I think when it's done, so like I started collecting comics. My first actual print comics that I bought in a local comic shop were with DC's New 52, right? In 2011. So that's like test case number one in so many ways for okay, we're relaunching absolutely everything with a new number one. And I gotta say, as someone who was unfamiliar with the way comics worked, or relatively so at that time, that was immensely appealing.
Mm.
Like that was an extremely appealing thing. Now, obviously, over the past decade, we've seen that doubled down on in ways that I think are less appealing. So I think there's kind of a context and an approach that can make more sense, with series relaunches. I actually like DC. Oddly enough, I'm more of a Marvel guy, I suppose. At heart, I like both Marvel and DC. But
Yeah.
I will say, like DC's general idea throughout the 2010s with the New 52, and then in 2016 with DC Rebirth, I actually think they had kind of the right idea, which was
Mm.
basically like 5 years of story, let it run, 50 plus issues, then kind of do like a big hard reset where we're opening up the doors again for people to come in. What Marvel has done more often is they'll flood, hey, there's a new number one every year, or sometimes even two in one year, right? There are these famous examples of like Unbeatable Squirrel Girl has two number ones in 2015, So like it's kind of goofy when you have way too many. So I don't love sort of the cynical sales tactic of it, but I do like the general idea of I like the idea of relaunching universes to some extent.
Okay.
At least with like a theme and a general idea of like this is the era we're in. Because so I'm a big like fan of comics continuity, is the thing we talked about. Like I like the fact that the Marvel universe rushes back to 1961 and DC even more so, right? That is really appealing to me. I don't get lost in that, but I think what helps is when you have these sort of tentpole ideas or themes where it's like, yeah, this is the New 52 era. Yeah, this is Marvel Now era, right? And you can say that encapsulates 3 years or so of comics. That stuff helps. And one thing I see a lot on Comic Book Herald is like people search for that. People remember that, right? They remember the branding, and then they know like literal searches in Google for, even Marvel Now are like
Mm.
hundreds and hundreds a day, probably up in the thousands because people remember that branding and they're like, hey, how do I get into that era? It seemed like there was some cool stuff there.
Right.
So I like initiatives like that. I think the trap that publishers have fallen into, Marvel probably especially, is DC's fallen into different traps, but Marvel especially is like they have a new initiative or for a while it felt like every 6 months. Now they've been in kind of this Marvel fresh start mode since 2018, and it's like, yeah, it feels like they've settled down. It feels like they're in a healthier place, I think, in a lot of ways. So that's a long way of saying, like, I guess it depends. But I do, as a fan of the medium and of like these long arcing, like, what do you call them? These long arcing continuities. I don't mind a number one reset every so often, but I don't want them to throw away the continuity with that. Like that's
Right.
not actually what I'm looking for.
Right. And I know when we were talking about like when I was a kid, it's like reading comics and they had that annual event. Uh, was you looking forward to it? When you're in your when you're in your
Right.
13 or 14, it's like this is something that's building up. You're looking forward to it. Now as an adult, it just seems like these annual events are just like a chore. It's like, well, now I gotta. They didn't just have one. It's like
Yeah.
time just flies by so much quicker.
Oh yeah.
Um,
No, like in the last 2 years, maybe three, I guess, if we'll run it back to 2019, the Marvel universe has been invaded and like nearly conquered, I think like four times now,
yeah,
like via four different events, So it's like it's not only that they're happening probably a little too frequently, it's like they're kind of hitting the same beats too. They're kind of doing the same thing.
yeah,
And that is less appealing and it burns people out and you get all this backlash against events. But then I don't know, at the same time, it's like events get so much more attention too. I see that as a guide writer on Comic Book Herald. It's like my number one piece of content right now over the last 2-3 months is the King in Black, which is
mm,
Marvel's ongoing event. So I think people who are immersed in the medium for longer, they will definitely say like, I'm tired of events, I'm sick of them, they don't mean anything, et cetera, et cetera. But then for the broad audience, whether it's new readers, whether it's just Wednesday Warriors, whatever, uh,
yeah.
that still does work, you know. So I you get why Marvel keeps doing it when you start seeing some of the analytics, because it's like, I don't know, there's an argument to be made, like maybe it's not the healthiest thing, and like, okay, it's short term, but you can see the numbers going up in the
Mm.
short term, and it's like, well, that's why they're doing it, right? The
Mm.
graph's going up to the right, I think.
And so, as a guide writer, how much of a challenge is that for you to feel as though that are you proactive or reactive when it comes to writing these guides and reviews? Do you feel like you have to like get every title, or are you like are you saying unabashedly saying these is what I concentrate on? If you're if you're looking for something about, I don't, Silver Sable or whatever, something that's like that's something that's how do you judge your readership in the sense when you make these guides?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So with the reading order guides that I do for like ongoing events, for example, and that's like my bread and butter with Comic Book
Mm-hmm.
Herald has been reading order guides. Basically, read this, then that, right? And so with like characters or something, there's a little more wiggle room. There's
Mm-hmm.
there's a little more like flexibility in terms of, okay, if you want to read Nightcrawler comics, you don't literally need to read number one, number two, number three, number four, right? There's some wiggle room.
Right.
With an event, though, generally the way it's going to work out is you're going to have your core event issues, you're going to have your tie-ins, and you are going to want to read them in a pretty particular order. Now, the challenge and the reason that like making reading orders makes some sense is publishers will toss them out and they don't always align with like when the issues come out, right? So there's a release date when each of these comics comes out, but the story progression, the chronology of what's happening there doesn't always map to when the issues come out. So Black Cat #2, which just came out as a King of Black tie-in, might actually fit
Mm-hmm.
better after core event issue #2 instead of issue #3. But technically, it was really right. It's a whole thing. So for me, definitely like one thing, I was definitely more obsessive about it when I started, in terms of like, I need to get this absolutely right. Like I can think of specific comics and moments in like the 2000s when I was setting up guides through that era that I must have read, like dozens of times, because I kept flipping and flopping on like, oh no, Daredevil was in prison here, so this issue has to be after this part of Civil War, but then like something else would happen and you think, no, maybe before, right? There were moments like that where I used to be quite obsessive about it.
Right.
I'm definitely more flexible now in terms of what I care about as much personally. But when I'm doing a new event, like the comments are going to the readers that use those things, that like them, they want it to be accurate. They don't want to read an issue out of chronology because it might like spoil something that happened that they haven't read yet. And I think that's the worst thing I can do, is recommend a comic to somebody that is so out of order that it kind of like ruins that story. It kind of ruins that environment because now they got information that they didn't have yet. So that's the thing that I'm probably worry about the most when I'm making these, and put the most thought into. But yeah, like King and Black's coming out, I read everything. I mean, I
Mm.
read all the issues. It doesn't mean I want to read everything.
Right.
you know, like, like anyone, there are books I like more than others, and there are books I'm excited to read and tie-ins I know I'm not going to like, but it's still important to me to actually read the thing and figure out where it's supposed to fit in this event. Oftentimes it's easy. I think publishers are getting better about it, frankly, in terms of knowing that, like, yeah, this is a thing people care about. And they typically have checklists and things, but even those, like, they're always aligned to release date, which doesn't always
Mm.
make sense.
You're gonna message from Fresh News 24/7 saying, "Comic Herald, massive fan. I got your videos after every X issue." So,
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Yeah, no, the X-Men focus has been really fun for me. So that has started since House of X and Powers of 10, right? I've always been are you a big X-Men fan? Like, are you an X-Men reader yourself?
oh me, oh yeah, yeah. I got a stack of them here. These are the and I got all of them, and I remember we can talk a little bit later about Hellions. Hellions. I love Hellions too. That's
Yeah,
a
it's great.
fun comic.
Yeah, no,
Yeah,
it's shockingly great. But no, I've always been X-Men was always my favorite
yeah.
superhero team, certainly. I probably would say Spider-Man's my favorite hero. But X-Men's probably like the thing I've been most into, and most like 98% that's through like the 90s animated series. Like that's kind of what I grew up on. So it really wasn't until House of X and Powers of 10 that I kind of had like an experience, this thing I hadn't even realized, where I'm like, oh, I actually have like cause to pull these issues in my shop now, because
Mhm.
from 2011 to 2018, there are X-Men comics I like within that bag, but generally speaking, it was a very mixed bag, and there's some stuff in there I didn't care for at all. So it became the first time where I really got to dig in, and then at the same time, I was kind of trying to figure out like how do I get Comic Book Herald on YouTube? What do I do with this? What kind of analysis are people looking for? And it kind of just became this really nice synergy of like, I'm so into House of X and Powers of 10 right now. Everyone's talking about them. I'll try some videos on that. And I came up with the series Crack and Krakoa. So kind of like trying to do the same thing with the guides where it's like, how do we make this accessible? How do we talk about the comic book history that influences these stories and just share sort of the passion and the history of the medium in a way? And now I'm approaching like my 150th Crack and Krakoa episode. People seem to dig it. And it's definitely helped like Comic Book Herald on YouTube. I mean, it is interesting because it's like all anyone on YouTube thinks of me as now is like an X-Men guy, like that's my thing, just doing X-Men, which is funny because like that's never been my brand before this. Like that's not the Comic Book Herald brand in any way. But I dig it. It's enjoyable to have like this community of people who just are super into these comics and want to talk about them. It's cool.
And you have a couple podcasts too, as well as like you have My Marvelous Year and My Ultimate Year too. Those are yours too?
Yeah, so I do technically I guess I do 3 podcasts. So I do there's just the Comic Book Herald podcast is called Best Comics Ever. I think if you search Comic Book Herald or Best Comics Ever, you'll find it. And that one predominantly at this point is me interviewing creators. So I do a series where I'll talk to various comics creators and ask them about stuff I like, basically comics that they've done that I like. I've got interviews. Actually, I've got 2 interviews tomorrow, which I would not recommend anyone ever do. Do not schedule 2 interviews on the same day. But it's a lot of work, but it's fun. And then we do My Marvelous Year Reading Club. My Marvelous Year is a thing I put together, I think around 2016. And it's a reading club that takes you from Marvel's Origins, 1961, Fantastic Four #1, through to as far as we can go, basically, as far as today. And the framework that I did was to say, okay, we're not literally going to try and read every Marvel comic because that to me does not sound fun. Some people do it. Some people can do it. And it's incredible. Like the stamina it takes to take on that initiative, like more power to you. But for me, it was like, no, I'm going to do like these 10 curated kind of like, here's the best or here's the most essential stuff from year to year. Yeah. So like we're on 1989 right now. We've covered a lot of ground. We just finished up X-Men Inferno. We did the main event and the crossovers in 2 issues. So like each year we'll do like, I don't know, 4 or 6 episodes, something like that, where we kind of talk about like, here's all the crucial comics. And I think the fun part about it is like, it's a reading club podcast. So
Cool.
if people like, if they want to get into Marvel and they want to read these stories again, like at a reasonable pace in an enjoyable way, we're like, hey, here's these issues for this week, these issues for this week. It's a whole, what do you call it? Like, it shouldn't feel like homework. I don't, it's not a treat. It's somewhere in between. Yeah. But yeah, that's My Marvelous Year. And then My Ultimate Year is the same idea, except going through actually literally every comic in the Ultimate Universe. So Marvel's Ultimate Verse that launched in the 2000s. We're actually reading all of them because it is condensed and confined to be like, a thing that where you actually can read all those and not be miserable about it. And I do both of those with a co-host, Zachary Dean, who basically just kind of emailed me out of the blue one day and was like, hey, like Comic Book Herald, I think a podcast would be cool. And I was like, because it was a thing I thought about before. I'm like, I know My Marvelous Year would be a good podcast that like I could wish more people could get access to this and kind of make it a bigger thing. Because I only had it on the website at that point. But I was like, I feel like I'll just lose interest. I feel like I'll start it and I won't be able to maintain doing all the work because there's a lot that goes into running a website, it turns out. But he came on and he was like, hey, I think that'd be good. And together we've put it out and found a really cool community who wants to like get into Marvel and enjoy this along with us. So it's been a blast. That's one of my favorite things I've done over the last, I think, 2 years now. That's like Comic Book Herald, Comic Book Herald related thing is the My Marvelous Year Club. So check it out if you haven't, because it's really fun.
So Fresh asked the question is like, how long until Ultimate Universe Marvel returns, and who do you think will be in charge?
I think Donny Cates I think it was a couple of years ago now. There's Donny Cates and Tom Taylor, I think, were tweeting about like, hey, you want to start the Marvel Ultimate Universe? And it was just kind of like a guys having fun thing, but that's definitely a popular theory. I remember, I think it was at C2E2 that year even. I was at one of the Marvel panels in every con, back when we had those and it was safe to do so,
Mhm.
they'll at the end of it they'll be like, all right, get up for questions, and it's just like it's a total like absolute chaos of like these like could be great questions from trained journalists, or they could just be these like madcap like rambling things from fans in the audience, right? It's just like you never know what you're gonna get. But I got in line and I asked Marvel editor in chief CB Cebulski if there were plans for the Ultimate Universe, because at the time I was like, 2020 is coming up, it'd be the 20th anniversary of the Ultimate line. That could make a lot of sense.
Right.
So what do you think? And he was like, well, at the time, there's no plans. So I don't know. I don't know if they're actually if they would do it. I feel like it would be a hit. I mean, honestly, I think they know it would be a hit if it was a Donny Cates run initiative. I mean, he's extremely hot in terms of like sales right now. So I mean, yeah, it'd be massive. I have no doubt about that. For whatever reason, it doesn't quite seem like they want to do it. I don't know. It seems like they're kind of holding off on that. I mean, I think part of it is like, you think about the appeal of the Ultimate Universe as its own standalone Marvel Universe thing, but that appeal did fade.
Yeah.
You think about the launch and you think about like the Ultimates by Mark Miller and Brian Hitch and how big that was, and but then it's like you get like 3-4 into it, 3-4 years. It's like, all right, we're starting to see this thing slow down. So I don't know, like you have to consider like my idea has always been, I think the Ultimate Universe should be a thing that reboots every like 5 to 10 years.
Hmm.
Like every 5 to 10 years, you just bring in new creative talent. You align it with where we are actually as a culture, because otherwise it runs into the same stale sort of like recycled continuity problems that every long running, like superhero universe or just comics in general runs into. I think with the Ultimate Universe, the coolest thing they could do would be like, yeah, we're gonna do 5 years of this in and out, and then we're going to reboot it, and we'll do a new Ultimate Universe with somebody else, like kind of as the head curator, and new creative talent. So that's my pick. I think that'd be awesome, but we'll see.
And no, so for the layperson now, wasn't the Ultimate Universe kind of like the footprint for the MCU more or less, or
In a lot of ways, yeah. I mean, it's very influential for sure, right? Like
yeah,
I mean, the Mark Miller and Brian Hitch Ultimates run is hugely influential on the MCU. I like their Nicholas Fury. I called him
right?
Nicholas. I feel
Nicholas,
like I'm an angry parent.
you know this proper name.
I refer to him as Nicholas. No, Nick Fury. He's Samuel L. Jackson in their comic, right? Like they depicted him
Yeah.
as Sam, everything about it, and then they get casted that way, and here we are. I mean, definitely the Iron Man influence is very strong. It sort of depends on what character you're looking at, but generally, like there's an Ultimates feel to the way the Avengers came to the big screen in the MCU. And then you can jump up and down different characters, but yeah, it's a very influential enterprise. And the cool thing about it too was like, because it wasn't Earth 616, because it wasn't mainline, they could take bigger swings, they could take bigger chances. And even if they didn't work, there was ambition and idea there that like wouldn't have necessarily been tried in Earth 616. And in many cases, the stuff that they tried like then would get used later in 616, so it's like those ideas do tend to come up at some point. But yeah, the Ultimate Universe remains interesting even when it's not good, and I think that's actually very valuable in superhero comics because it gives you something to talk about. Gives you something to think about.
And so talk a bit about, when you make these guides, have you ever made a guide from, a reader or somebody say, hey, you know what, I got my kid starting to read, can you make a guide for this or that? Or have you always just been try to forward facing to kind of decide on what the guides that you would think that your audience would want to read?
Yeah, I mean, I think initially, it would be mostly based around just what I was reading, what I was interested in. I mean, for the longest time, I was just playing catch up. I just constantly felt like it was like there were a million things I didn't have,
Mm.
So like as you're starting to build a website and build your own content, it's like I don't have anything. So like I mean, probably the first one I did that I really got into and had some success with actually was Thanos. Like I probably
Okay.
published that in like I published it like right around or I think before Avengers came out. And then there was that big stinger in the MCU at the end, the post credits with Thanos as like, okay, I'll do it myself. And then it was like all of a sudden there was all this interest. And I had like kind of the reading order on the character. So that was the first time I realized, I think like, hey, if I make a lot of these, I
Mhm.
could get a lot of people visiting my website. But I mean, now I've built up so much, through the years that like, yeah, I mean, I'll take reader requests. That's one of the benefits of like the Patreon I run, where people support the site, which is super generous. One of the tiers is like you can request a certain amount of characters that I'll do a reading order guide for. That's where I get some of the weirder ones. Like of all the characters that I don't have, some are still like decent sized. I have like Glob Herman, like a super minor supporting X-Men character. I have a reading order on him. I have somebody just request Koi Boy. Actually, was my co-host, actually, Zach on the Myron Sear show, requested Koi Boy, who's in the Unbeatable Squirrel Girl. So like I'll get some specific Patreon requests for like very minor characters like that. Meanwhile, like Quicksilver is nowhere to be found or something, right? Like there's
Right.
still a handful of bigger ones. But yeah, generally it's like now I'm just kind of now it's like actually hard to think of them because so I kind of I'll chase like, hey, the MCU's talking about doing these, or they might bring in this character. Do I have guides for all them, et cetera, et cetera? And like, all right, I got to figure out, do I have all my WandaVision covered? Do I have Loki and Sam Cap and all? Because those are going to be big
Right.
this year. But yeah, no, it's and I'm a marketing person by day, it's my job. So I actually like looking into trends and kind of figuring out like what it is people are looking for. That's appealing to me. So I actually enjoy the process of researching like what characters are people into that I don't have, or what are some comics that sometimes there's stuff even that I've like read that I wouldn't have thought to make a reading order of. We actually just have one that's going to go live fairly soon, but like Avatar is big on Netflix, right?
Mhm.
Right now there's like a second wave of like people loving Avatar: The Last Airbender, and it's got like actually a surprisingly great like detailed comics history. And we have somebody who pitched doing an Avatar reading order, and I was like, yeah, please, like that'd be awesome. So they put that together because I haven't read those comics. So
Right.
now I'm at the point where I'm actually like, contracting them out. Like I actually have writers and talented people who are making these things themselves, which is like that's the first time I've ever been in this position where I'm not the one doing everything, which is awesome.
So like let's create a hypothetical. Like the you're talking about random characters, like someone like, so what would you do? What would you do if you went about on a completely like C or D level like DC character from like the Legion of Superheroes, like like how would you go about as a researcher? What would you do first? How would you create that reading order?
Yeah, I mean, so the first thing I do is, I mean, generally at this point, like I'll have read some of their comics. It's a rarity where like I would truly not even know who they are. But like, yeah, if somebody came and was like, I want a Starboy reading order from Legion. I mean, one of the harder things to do with like characters that are predominantly known on teams too is like
Right.
you have to. It's hard to separate like Legion reading order versus a Starboy reading order. This comes up with the
Right.
X-Men the most, I would say now, because a lot of times I'm like, all right, let's make a Wolverine reading order. It's like, cool. Do you just want an X-Men guide? Or, and Wolverine's a little easier because he has solo series. But then if you
Right.
do it with like Psylocke or like even like Juggernaut or something, it's like, all right, I don't literally just want just the X-Men comics here. We got to find where else they pop up. So within the greatest weapons or the greatest strengths at this point to figure these things out is first, I'll just look at like, what do I know? What are the stories I'm thinking of? And then utilizing like Marvel Unlimited and DC Universe, which I think just got rebranded as something else, Infinite maybe.
Mm. Yep.
Basically, but going into the apps and just seeing like, all right, what stories of theirs do they have on these? What of these have I read? What are the collected editions? I mean, I don't want to like humble brag about my obsessive knowledge of collected editions, but I've named so many of them by hand, making all these guides that I have like a weird recollection of like what the available trades are for different teams and characters and stuff. So a lot of times it's just a matter of going to Amazon and like typing in their name, and it's like, all right, they have 5 trades. Let's start there. That's somewhere to start, and then fill in the details around that. You
Right.
know. So and then if like I really don't know where else to turn outside of actually reading more stories and kind of seeing where they are, then you could always turn to like Wikipedia, which will occasionally have some, footnote annotation of some issue I haven't heard of before. That's actually come in handy a handful of times on Crack and Krakoa stuff, where
Okay.
I might, like, for example, like that's kind of a spoiler, but like if a character shows up and I don't actually know that much about him, quick hop into the wiki, look at some issues, go read those in Marvel Unlimited, get a feel for that story. Like that's usually, it'll send me on the right track for what I want to talk about. So I don't know. There's no there's no like one size fits all thing. You know, if it's something I don't know about, but that's my general
Right.
thinking. I think when I put it together. Yeah.
Okay. Wow, that's interesting. So I mean, and so yeah, and you did talk about you did talk about your Patreon. I want to pull it up for people to see. You have a great. I mean, it's I love what you did here with your Patreon. Is that you have, like you mentioned before, and this was something they recently put out there with their annual. You saved that wasn't that just like about 6 months ago they launched
Yeah,
that.
they just started that, which has been cool for sure.
Yeah. Do you want to quick, talk a bit about what your subscription tier levels are?
Yeah, sure. So yeah, over on patreon.com/comicherald, people can support the site, which is super, super appreciated. It was a thing that I was like, I was definitely hesitant to make a Patreon for a while. You know, it just
Mm,
I don't know, there's like a weird feeling of like I don't want to ask for anything to do this because I love it and I would do it anyway. But once I did sort of figure out like, well, how can I actually add some value that I would feel good about, you know, that at least that like, well, then people are getting something out of the deal or at least have potential to get something different out of the deal that they wouldn't get anyway.
right.
Then I felt good about it. And like people are one thing I found definitely with Comic Herald and at least my slice of the comic sphere is like people are quite nice and generous more often than not, you know. Obviously some people like there are very loud you know, like people who can get under your skin and that will happen. But the majority are quite nice and people that support anything on Patreon I think tend to be like I don't know, just extremely giving people. Yeah, so the tiers that I have is like for $1 a month support. I think the general benefit that you get there is just like early access to like questions basically like one hard thing for me as Comic Girl got bigger was like I would get lots of emails asking questions about
Mm.
reading orders, and like questions tend to be very long and very specific, right? Because they're going through their comics journey and they're trying to get help. And I will literally get subject lines that are like help triple exclamation point, and it's somebody talking about like where Spider-Man fits in continuity. And it's like that is not a triple exclamation point help email, but I appreciate your fandom here. But like one thing I ran into was like I can't get to all the emails anymore. You know, I started out, I wanted to, and it just got to a point where I couldn't. So
Right.
one of the benefits is like you can get priority access. I will definitely get your question if you ask it on Patreon. And then yeah, there's other stuff too, just like you know, getting podcasts early, getting I do like Q&As that I only release on Patreon. I do at the $5 tier, which I call the Club of Heroes.
Mhm.
You get like a reading playlist. So
Oh,
every
cool.
month, yeah, every month I put together like a custom like reading playlist, which is basically the idea is like here's your comics for the month that I would recommend you read. So I do it via all the different streaming services essentially that I recommend. So I've got like Marvel Unlimited. I'm like, yeah, check these out. These are new. These are good. I'll put in like a chunk of comics that I used for research the previous month, you know. So like just hey, here's the stuff I was reading. I'll put in my DC stuff. I'll put in Hoopla, which if you're not familiar with as a listener, Hoopla is like a basically it's a library loan app, but it's all digital. So
Oh,
like all you need
cool.
is a library card, and then it's free. And then they have a huge digital library of comics, and like they actually get trades like day and date. So like stuff comes out, you know, and like they'll have it that day
Huh.
in the Hoopla library. It's a really really valuable resource if you can get access to it with your library card or whatever.
Right.
But I'll use that and I'll recommend new comics there. And then what else I've been doing? Oh, and then I'll recommend, you know, like different creators I have coming up for interviews. So, you know, so I'll be like, hey, check out these works we're going to talk about. But people seem to like that, which is cool.
They should have, as you're talking, I'm wondering they should have because you always have these watch parties where you watch. Is there an app that you can do a read party where you can like read with other people? Is that or is that that might be weird? I don't know.
I agree with yeah, I don't know. It is funny. It's like that's definitely like a thing that you hear older creators talk about. Like, you know, like we would get our comics and we would all go and we would all read them together kind of thing.
Right.
You know,
Yeah.
but it's hard to share it's hard to share a reading experience the same way like all your eyes are on a screen moving at the same pace, you know,
Right.
but definitely I feel like there's that kind of like post game reading experience, which I feel like is what YouTube has offered in a lot of ways where it's like, hey, we all just read this comic and now we want to talk about it
Right.
and kind of have that conversation that way. But yeah, no, it's pretty interesting. But yeah,
Yeah.
no, I appreciate everybody who supported the site over on patreon.com. and / Comic Book Herald. And yeah, I've got some much higher tier things where it's like, I think at the $10 a month level, which is very generous and I appreciate a lot. One of the benefits there is like you get your name read out on my YouTube videos as like one of the supporters. Basically, if you have reading order requests or questions, like you get number one priority.
Right.
And then everything else, in the lower tiers. And then my like almost joke tier that literally one person has done is the number 30 for the Merry Mephistos. I was like, you can come on the podcast and re-rank some stories that I have on my best comics ever list, which is like, if you Google best comics of all time, Comic Book Herald winds up being one of the top things there. It's my list of, I capped it finally at 500. So it's my 500 favorite comics. And every comic I read, every story, I put in this list. I put in the spreadsheet and I rank them, and then I adjust it over time, right? So, and that obviously leads to one, it leads to a lot of views because people love that, but then also it leads to a lot of like controversy because people are like, how could you rank this above this? So the joke there essentially is like, fine, you can come on the podcast and you can argue with me about my ranking for something. But I think we've had effectively one taker on that so far, which is fine.
And so, and one of your more recent, and as I said, you have a fantastic as well, a fantastic YouTube channel. So people definitely check that out too. And you just recently came out like 5 days ago, and so I can't wait. I'm looking forward to reading these your new XMen titles.
Thanks,
Some
yeah.
of those there. So the WandaVision, I know we mentioned before we went on the air.
Yeah.
So talk about the reading order that you had set up on this video for WandaVision. That seems to be the a lot of hits for that.
Yeah. So so WandaVision is obviously the big new Disney Plus show, right? And it was pretty
Yep.
exciting. That it's like it's been a long time since we've had MCU content.
It's been like 18 months, right?
Yeah, right.
Just
Like,
about.
which is it's kind of fascinating, like all the things that led to that, which make a lot of sense.
Right.
But it's an exciting thing to have back, I would say, and just to like be able to relax and just chill out with some WandaVision. I watched the first 2 episodes, I dug it a lot, but definitely like running a website, having a YouTube channel, I was like, all right, I should probably like address this thing that everyone's going to be talking about. So we got a whole bunch, like I've got a lot of stuff going with that, but one that kept coming up is I kept seeing people tweet or share just like, oh, like what should we read? And a lot of people be like, oh, just read Vision and House of M. And I kept just kind of having that nerd reaction of like that's not the best rec. So finally I put together my list of the 11 best comics to read with those, which are a little more outside the box, not too crazy.
Right.
But I did a video on it as well because it was easy enough. Not everything I write, is going to get turned into a video, but this one was like, I'm like, I have the assets, I have all the images ready. I already wrote the 2,000 words or whatever, script. Like, and I tend to, I don't write like full scripts for everything now, but I do. I'm more of a writer than I am, I would say, just like a public speaker, so I do like to organize my thoughts in that way. So if I already have the article written, I'm already 70% of the way there to making a thing. But yeah, so that was making that video, which was fun. I mean, so I published best WandaVision comics. We had a writer, Sarah Century, wrote the best Scarlet Witch stories last week. And then we have every Friday, so with every new release of a WandaVision episode, I'm going to have a different critic, a different writer for the site, write about a different era of Scarlet Witch and kind of what they would do with the character, because Scarlet Witch has become this character in the Marvel comics that like nobody knows what to do with. She's constantly like a challenge and has been really put through the ringer in a lot of ways. So we've got a piece going up tomorrow. Actually, it's written by John Galati, one of my absolute favorite writers on the site. And he talks all about her powers, how wild they are, like magic and hex powers, and just like, how do we even get our heads around this? And then at the end of it, he's got a pitch for like, here's what I think Wanda should be. Here's an idea. It's really cool. I would recommend people read that if they haven't already. But yeah, no, it's a lot of fun. And it is like, I'm not like Vulture. I'm not like IGN or something. Like I don't need to have like an endless stream of content. So for me, it's more just like, all right, this thing is happening that people are excited about. What's a cool idea that we can tap into? That is, again, like with the best of list, with the guides, it's like, what is actually helpful here? What is it that can actually like help people enjoy comics? Because at the end of the day, that's kind of, I think more people should be reading comics. I think more people would enjoy it and would like to. And I want to encourage that, in ways that I can. So, yeah,
And I'm so glad you mentioned in your list too about the miniseries Star, where Scarlet Witch made that thing. And that's the most recent thing she's been in. The Scarlet Witch has.
And it was total It was total luck that I even read that
Oh,
because
really?
I
Okay.
I had just I had an interview with the writer of that series, Kelly Thompson. I got the chance to interview her, and I basically we've been trying to schedule it for months,
Right.
and it just so happened that I was reading Star the night before WandaVision was going to debut, and I was like, oh, this happens to be a really good Scarlet Witch story, which I would not have guessed and would not have known. So yeah, that was some nice cosmic comics coincidence that I happened to check that out. And I would recommend Star. I gotta say, I didn't expect that I would. I quite like Kelly Thompson as a writer. I think she's one of my favorite writers at Marvel. But that book, I was like, this is like a weird Captain Marvel spinoff. I'm like, why? Like, why is this happening? Why is the character getting a spinoff? They didn't really sink their hooks into me just in the pages of Captain Marvel. But that mini is actually like, it's got Scarlet Witch stuff. It's got Black Order stuff. If you know from Infinity War, Thanos and all that. And it gets really cosmic in ways I didn't expect. So check out Star if you are relatively familiar and a fan of Captain Marvel, because it is worth it, I would say.
Yeah, yeah, and that's like you said that, and I think it's like it's 5 issues. I thought it kind of threw me off a bit because usually miniseries are either 4 or 6, and that was like 5. But
Yeah, no, it's light. You can read it in a night.
yeah,
But
yeah,
it's
it's
but it's
good.
good stuff.
Yeah, and so yeah, and so a part of it, and so talk to us a bit about. And I know I kind of want to pick your brain on what your because it's not giving away spoilers because there really isn't anything to spoil with the first 2 episodes of WandaVision. But what I wanted to kind of see what your thoughts are on where you think they're going to be going in this series.
Sure, sure. So I really enjoyed the first 2 episodes. I liked them a lot. Mainly because my dad was like a huge Dick Van Dyke fan.
Hmm.
So I grew up on a lot of Dick Van Dyke, and it just have an affinity for that. I know for different, maybe you have a different kind of touch point, but I know like some people have said like, oh, I Love Lucy, Bewitched, right? Like different touch points that people have gravitated to. For me, it was definitely like, oh, I'm watching Dick Van Dyke episodes again. And that was very fun. That
Yeah,
was very enjoyable. And I really appreciated how thoroughly they committed to like doing that well. Like it just felt like they made a pretty quality remake of a show that I really enjoyed, as opposed to just like wink, wink, nudge, nudge. Hey, we're referencing this thing. Do you get it? It was like, no, they're like really earnestly doing this.
yeah.
And I
It was
love
like the
that.
setup. It was like the same sound, almost like they try to do the sound stage almost exactly like in that first episode.
Exactly,
Yeah,
exactly. And I appreciate the heck out of that. They were just fun to watch. It was the first time in a while where I watched something and then like the next day I was like kind of bummed and I'm like, why do I feel kind of like sad right now? And I was like, oh, it's because I don't have more to watch.
yeah,
Like actually disappointed. There's not another episode right now. It's like I'm not like I don't think it's like the best thing since sliced bread or anything. Like I think it's good, but at the same time,
right.
I'm like I'm extremely excited for episode 3 tomorrow.
Yeah,
Where do I think they're going? I think so. I mean, I don't know. It's a show so loaded with Easter eggs that
right.
it's like if you actually talk about what you're seeing and what's going on, it can feel spoilery, I suppose. So I would say like for people who want to know nothing, like earmuffs or whatever, because like because it can, if you just want to enjoy it and go on the ride, I get that, I hear that.
Yeah.
For me, I would say my initial thoughts were I expected. So I think there's two things going on with Wanda. My hope going into this was they weren't going to do a Wanda breaks reality, creates her own alternate reality as a result of like losing her mind to grief story. I really
Hmm.
don't want it to be that. And I think from the first 2 episodes and the tone and everything, I don't think it's going to be that. I
Okay.
think the clever trick because that has touch points in Marvel stories like Avengers Disassembled, House of M, right? Like different stuff throughout the 2000s and
Right.
even earlier, honestly, if you go back to like West Coast Avengers.
Right.
So, what I think the clever thing they did is I think Wanda, yes, she's going to have created this alternate reality. Like that's going to be as a result of something to do with her power set. But I think it's going to be kind of at the behest or maybe sort of like forced into it by
Sword.
either some yeah, either like sword or some sort of like corrupted like aim or hydra that has taken them over, or the crazier theory that a lot of people are talking about if you dig into this stuff is that Mephisto is involved, Marvel's devil, right? And that it's actually somehow Marvel's devil Mephisto is the one kind of like pulling the strings. So
Mm.
those I think are the two competing paths. I kind of don't know how the MCU would pull off like Mephisto the devil. like, like that's kind of a tall order, even in
Right.
a world where we're like, yeah, like superpowers exist. There's a Hulk, there's a Thanos. Like there's something about Mephisto that's actually like almost harder to take in. It's almost less palatable. That said, there are a lot of references to, not a lot, but there's a handful of references to like devils and small little throwaway lines here and there. Plus, I don't know if you remember this, but and I don't even know if this is a thing that people are talking about, but I remember leading up to, I think it was like when WandaVision was going to happen initially, because it got pushed.
Right.
Kind of everything got pushed, right? The pandemic hit, and there was a stretch though where Marvel was releasing a lot of trades that were like Mephisto based, or like
Mm.
more than usual. And it was like, oh, this character is going to have a role to play. At the time, I was thinking in like they were kind of setting up like a supernatural Marvel with Hellstrom and Ghost Rider and maybe something else over on Hulu. And like most of those series got axed.
Right.
Hellstrom got one season and it's done
Right.
already, right? They're not even
Yeah.
going to do the Ghost Rider, I think. But most of that stuff got axed, and it kind of made me think now, like, was all that like Mephisto content sort of
Just
a,
for like that Marvel Knights type thing they were
yeah,
relaunching. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. Like, was that a prelude to a
Right.
role in WandaVision? So I'm kind of, initially I was resistant. I was like, no way, that's too crazy. It's just going to be a sword and an aim thing. But now I'm like, probably is. It probably is
Yeah.
Mephisto.
I
What do
didn't
you
even
think?
think about the Mephisto. Because yeah, I saw one, one of the things I've been researching is the character Agnes is supposed, they're thinking that that character is Agatha something, the lady that was the witch that was part of Scarlet Witch's background.
Agatha Harkness, yeah.
Agatha Harkness is that actress might be her.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, that seems very likely. Because that's the thing with Wanda is like she's in the comics, she's a mutant with hex powers, but then
right.
pretty quickly they layer on the magic element, right? They're like, we need to give her a magic component where it's something where she has a little more control, where she's actually sort of trained. Because the hex powers were always just like, you're gonna trip, or like this wall is gonna fall on you. It's all just accidents, and like they could just happen. But yeah, Agatha Harkness is a longtime mentor of hers. The Mephisto thing that has roots in some John Byrne written West Coast Avengers
Okay, yeah.
from the late 80s. So I won't give away the story if people want to check it out.
Ye-
But that's why I think people gravitate towards that, and why in my mind I'm like, oh yeah, there's a history to this where I could see them doing their own thing with it.
Right. I think so. One part of it was like I'm wondering. There's a couple pieces for me is that I'm wondering if it's there was a cut scene that they were put in that Kevin Feige was going to put in at the end of Avengers Endgame where Wanda went to see Vision's dead body, and
Yeah.
that got cut out. And a part of me was wondering, like right when you first started talking about it, that is this a grief-induced hallucination that she is a part of? And I'm wondering if it's being measured and controlled by Sword to rebuild Vision,
Yeah.
because a part of me was that the one piece is because there are scenes like in the first episode where it's just Vision saying, "What am I doing here?" Like
Right.
he has his own consciousness about it. It's not involved with Wanda, who is in a different scene altogether, not in that meeting, that in that office space. And I'm wondering if Agnes, if you have like Mephisto who are taking some side doors in, who are taking advantage of this situation to kind
Yes.
of manipulate some things.
No,
So
I think you're onto something there for sure. Because my sort of fully fleshed out theory is like, I think Nick Fury comes to Wanda via Sword and
yeah,
says, "Hey, I think we can rebuild Vision. Let us try." Essentially, because it's in his best interest to have like this
yeah,
technology, this weapon as well.
yeah.
And I think Wanda's game. She's like, "Yeah, absolutely." They need her powers to do it. She gets something goes out of control for whatever reason, and that creates this alternate reality, or more likely sends them to like another dimension. And it just so happens to be the dimension of Mephisto. That's how we get
Mm,
him into the picture, where then he's like, "Hey, Wanda, I can actually just give you everything you want. All you have to do is stay here." Right. So
mhm,
that's why we have her living in this reality that is not reality, right? But why we have her living in this world that is TV sitcoms. And that's why there's, that moment in or episode number 2 where on the radio it's Jimmy Woo is like, Wanda, who's doing this to you? Who's doing this to you? So like Sword knows she's there. They know they can't get to her. They've tried. The little helicopter turned into a little toy or whatever, right?
Yeah.
They tried, but they can't get there. They know she's there. Who's doing it? I think it's probably Mephisto, and it's she's actually trapped in this alternate dimension. And his promise to her, his classic Prince of Lies thing, is like, yeah, I'll give you everything you want. You can have vision. You can be a happy family. Cool, done. And she's like, what do you get? Don't worry about it, right? You have your family. You're happy. So that's my fully fleshed theory for like how all this comes together. But the coolest thing about the MCU is they almost always like defy theories. Like they have a really smart, cool way of doing their own thing. I love that, you know? So like you can project and you can guess and this and that. And it's often it's like, oh, based on the comics, this might happen. And the MCU is very good about being like, yeah, we like element A from this comic story. We like element B from this other one, and they mash it all together in a way that feels unique. It feels original. So yeah, I'm excited to see where it goes.
Yeah, Fresh News asked, do you think we'll see Ultron or Quicksilver in the series?
I would love to see Quicksilver again. I think that would actually be extremely cool and make a lot of sense potentially. Because if it is this like Wanda made reality, like why couldn't he be there?
Right.
You know what I mean? Like they don't remember their past lives at this point. Why couldn't they? Don't remember Quicksilver's supposed to be dead as of Age of Ultron. The Ultron question, that's very interesting. I would be surprised a little if we brought Ultron back into it. I think it's more likely that like Vision, I don't think Vision actually gets brought back, but I think what happens is we start to bring in some of those connections to like Wonder Man that are there in the comics. Like they share the same brain patterns. I think probably what happens, if anything, is we get like the MCU version of Wonder Man made out of this. I mean, I'm game. If they want to bring back James Spader Ultron, sure, I'm here for it. But I'd be a little surprised by that. Personally.
Yeah, it's something like I said. Then they said this is going to be leading up to that seeding into the Doctor Strange 2. So that's a good point. They've always been there's strong hints at Mephisto. That would, or the other idea is that is she going to end up being the villain in Phase 3? I mean Phase 4. Who knows? So
yeah, I hope they don't go that route with Wanda, just because like that has been the fallback in comics for such a long time. And I think I think there's too much baggage there to do that with her. That said, it will be really interesting to see how they find a way around that, because her power levels are like preposterous. Like they're I mean, who is it? It's her and Carol Danvers at this, those are the power levels that you have competing. And Wanda's, I think, are even greater, because it's like she can reset reality and nobody else really can do that. So how do you have a character like that on your Avengers squad? Like what do you do with that character? Like that's a really hard question to answer. And I'm curious to see it.
Yeah, I mean, if you remember, like Avengers Endgame, that was the one sign of panic that Thanos had in his eyes, is when Scarlet Witch was like taking him on.
Yeah, right. And he like destroyed. What is it? He like destroys his own fleet to like get out of that. He's like, I'm in trouble. I need an out here. So like that's where Scarlet Witch is at. So her character is fascinating. I think like that's doing a show that is going to be part mystery and part just like feel good nostalgia about the history of TV. It's just so smart. Like I really, really respect the heck out of the fact that they're like, that's the idea you could do with these characters, because these characters are tough and they're characters that not a lot of people really care about. You know what I mean? Like, or like most like casual MCU fans aren't like, yeah, I really was into the Wanda and Vision bits. Like that's not what most casual fans like come away with. Obviously they have their fans, in the comics diehard sphere. But yeah, no, it's off to a great start.
Yeah. So this is great. So we I thought it'd be a quick hour, Dave. So I wanted everybody to definitely check out for your getting back into comics. If you like the MCU and you want to know where you want to dive back into, absolutely, I highly recommend comicbookherald.com. It's a great place. It's a great place to look at those beginner's guides. If you want to listen to a podcast, he's got you can see those podcasts that he has here. It's all here, comicbookherald.com.
Absolutely.
And definitely check out if it's, you want to support. And I was telling, Dave before we went on the air, I mean, it's like your guides and your reviews are so accessible. They're full of joy, inquiry, and there is a level of, like, I would say, like, you don't really hear this word used when it comes to guides and reviews, but there's a level of compassion involved into it where it's so easy to read. So
I appreciate that. Thank you. Yeah.
and check that out. And as I say, check out his YouTube channel. And so, yeah, Dave, anytime, man. I would love to have you come back on and just like, and I mean, chat about any of the other guides that you want to chat about. If we haven't talked about DC comics, maybe we can have you come back on and talk about DC sometimes.
Let's talk when Suicide Squad comes out. Let's see where we're at then.
Yeah. Great. Well, thanks a lot, Dave.
Yeah, thanks for having me. This is fun.
What is that? A Secret Wars framed picture? What is that?
There's a lot of Secret Wars going on behind me. So I've got it split into, the middle is you got that Avengers Brian Hitch thing, and then anything to the right that I frame is going to be Secret Wars related. So I've got my favorites over there are, I've got the Secret Wars #8, which is when Spider-Man gets his his famous black costume, right? And I got that signed by Mike Zeck. So that's a big favorite. And then the big print is a copy of, what is it, Secret Wars #11, I want to say.
But
it's a Mike Zeck cover. It's Doctor Doom, like after he battles him, so the armor's all torn, and it's that image which I love. And I saw Zeck at a con who did the art on so much of that and did those covers, and I bought it from him there, and he signed it for me, and we talked a little bit about working on the series. So that's like my Mike Zeck Secret Wars Hall of Fame, and then the one below it is like a Deadpool Secret Wars variant. And he's doing the Run the Jewels thing, and Run the Jewels is one of my favorite like rap groups of the last several years. So that one I just have an affinity for. But yeah, that's the light story of my Secret Wars Hall of Fame. I'm a huge fan of the old event, of the 80s event, of the 2015 version. And then ironically, Secret Wars 2 is like literally my least favorite comic event of all time, or close.
Really?
So like 1 and 3 I'm obsessed with, I love, and then 2 is like an absolute dud. But it happens.